Welcome everyone, great to see so many of you here, because this is the first North Norfolk Festival of Literature and Landscape, so a very special occasion and we're delighted to be here. Now today we're going to discuss probably one of the most important questions in front of us in the UK today. How do we tackle the biodiversity crisis and how do we achieve nature recovery? How do we balance the pressures relating to food production as well as other human needs, housing, energy, transport, with habitat and species recovery? And how optimistic can we be that is even possible? There is much to discuss, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by two very knowledgeable and hopefully very influential, can we say, people to share their thoughts. And despite working for the BBC, I've managed not to email them my questions and my research notes in advance, so I'm confident we can go ahead this afternoon. I don't think either need much of an introduction, but let me say Tony Juniper, or Dr. Tony Juniper CBE, to give full title, is perhaps best known today as Chair of Natural England, but has been a prominent voice in defence of nature for decades, holding leading roles with Friends of the Earth, with the WWF, with wildlife trusts. He has also found time to write multiple books. Perhaps the most pertinent titles for today's discussion are What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? And What Nature Does for Britain, and a new one on the way, that's right, isn't it?
Yes, next March.
Next March. So he'll be back for the second North Norfolk Literature and Landscape Festival next year. Jake Fiennes is very much at the cutting edge of nature recovery on the ground right here in North Norfolk. A conservationist and author, Jake manages the largest private national nature reserve in the country and is in charge of conservation across Holkham Estate's 25,000 acres. His recent book, Land Healer, looks at how we can repair the damage done to our landscape and rethink our relationship with nature through farming and land use. So one more time, please welcome Tony and Jake.
Thank
you. We're here for a conversation. We're also going to take some questions. I think we're going to have a roving mic, so I won't take too much time asking just my questions. We'll give you a go as well. And I don't want this to be too doom and gloom, because I think there's a lot of inspiration of things we hopefully can do. But Tony, I'm afraid I think it comes to you to start us off with where we are now and what is the state of nature today.
So England, in common with quite a few other countries, has seen a dramatic reduction in the nature that is now seen across landscapes in terms of the abundance of wildlife, songbird numbers down, insect numbers down, the ever-lengthening list of endangered species, things that are going to disappear completely, is going up, and of course the loss of habitats. And you put all these things together and it leads to the conclusion that this country is one of the most nature depleted on Earth. This has occurred over a very long period and is now reaching the stage where it's having a material impact on the quality of the experience that people have living in the country now. Less access to nature has health and well-being consequences. We know that degrading landscapes leads to more flooding. We have water crises now regularly when there's a period without much rainfall. And so all these things are beginning to feed back, leading to the conclusion that we now don't have enough nature anymore. And this is a really important point about the conversation we're having today, because up until quite recently, this whole discussion about the state of nature was couched in terms of conservation, and that was about hanging on to the remnants of rare populations of animals and plants, about protecting the last little remnants of good habitat. And now we're into a discussion about nature recovery, because we don't have enough nature to sustain the country in a way that we would like. And so then that's not only about stopping further decline, it's about moving into a period of stuff coming back. And that's different to what we've been doing, and it brings all sorts of challenges. And as you say, Joe, those challenges coming full square into conversations about how we're going to have more houses and how we're going to have a high quantity of domestic food production, to mention two sectors, not the only ones. So this is something that is, profound in the implications it has, because it's not just about looking after nature reserves. We have to continue to do that, and there are some great examples, and Jake running one of the most successful in the country. But we're going to have to go beyond that to embrace true landscape vision and to be thinking about ways in which we can combine this recovery of nature with all the other things that the country wants to do.
And when we look at the decline, so often we read since 1970. Since 1970, this has crashed, that has crashed. So it's very much on our watch. This is maybe been happening before that, but we've certainly got fairly good baseline to show it's been rapid in recent decades.
Yes, the last 50 years. So if you look at the WWF Living Planet report, and this country is a good example of what's gone on, we're now at about a 70% lower figure when it comes to vertebrate populations. So birds, reptiles, mammals have declined by about 70% since the 1970s. And that's a global phenomenon, but it's one that's very visible here. And, it links into all sorts of very big questions about land use, about pollution, about the demands for more land for food and for housing. At the same time now, of course, on top of all of that, we have this multiplier in the form of climate change hitting on top of all of that. And this then requires a big response. This is the trouble. Nature and environment often seen as a bit of a silo, a bit of a sector, when in fact it touches everything. And if we're going to fix it, we have to fix it through action in these other economic sectors. And this is where it gets quite challenging politically.
And if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's got to the point where it's not just sort of looking at nature as a nice to have and these nature reserves, it's actually our life support systems on planet Earth, isn't it?
Yeah, the repositioning of this whole discussion, it was the case until quite recently where the decline of nature was regarded by quite a few people, and still is in many places, as the price of progress. We're going to lose a bit of nature, but that's going to be compensated for by economic growth, which is going to create jobs and wealth and well-being. Therefore, it's regrettable, but it's inevitable, and we'll tolerate it. This misses the point that our entire civilization is underpinned by ecosystems, and the more we degrade ecosystems, the more we imperil human well-being. And that realization is still yet to connect in some very important places, lots of finance ministries and boardrooms. The old narrative of balance, whereby we tolerate a bit of nature destruction in order for economic goals to be met, that still prevails. And so breaking through that misconception is a big part of what we still need to do.
And you mentioned vertebrates. You mentioned actually sort of humans look through a certain filter, and we've looked at the wildlife we quite like.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we're still yet having that conversation with invertebrates, with the insects and the sort of the bottom of the pyramid that support life.
Exactly. The vertebrates are sitting at the top of a set of layers of life, which, if you remove those, the whole thing collapses, which is why it's so troubling to see this incredible decline in insect numbers that's taking place. Actually, Dave Goulson, one of our top entomologists earlier this year, said that he reckons now, compared with the 1940s, we've seen a 90% reduction in insect numbers in this country, which is quite terrifying. And, anyone paying attention this summer to butterflies and bees in particular, there were very few. And, this is the consequence of these other pressures really kind of coming now to a series of consequences. And, in the case of insects, habitat loss, probably the big one, followed by the effects of different kinds of pollution, including pesticides, with layered on top of that now this enormous impact from global heating, causing, for example, that drought in 2022, which had a huge impact on insect populations, followed by a very wet spring. And if you've got depleted populations of bees and butterflies that, are then being hit by these massive systemic pressures, it's harder for them to recover.
Right. Because they will always adapt to the climate if they were in good numbers.
Yeah.
But if we reduce them to such an extent, there's sort of no safety net that when there is then a really wet spring, they don't recover in the same way.
Yeah, and the pace of global warming is likely to overwhelm some species. It's going far too quickly for many to adapt.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've covered the gloomy stuff pretty well. And the data's not in doubt, is it?
No. This is not in doubt. Yeah. This is a crisis. I don't think there's any other word for it, really.
Jake, let's bring you in here. As we start to look at how we work landscapes and how we manage them, we have to look first at food and farming, don't we? First of all, I suppose to follow on from Tony, where have the problems come from with how we farm the landscape?
So 40% of habitable land is in agriculture globally. 70% of the UK is in some form of agriculture. Agriculture has a huge impact, both negatively and potentially positively, in restoring biodiversity. We have to change the way we produce our food. We have to change the way where we produce our food. In the food strategy written by Henry Dimbleby, 20% of our nutrition comes from, 3% of our nutrition comes from 20% of the land. So there's a vast areas of land that we can repurpose, that can readdress the balance in nature. That's problematic because you have traditions. You have traditions in agriculture and land use and land ownership, and how we address that. And that's not just necessarily an issue for the UK, but it's also an issue globally. So how can we facilitate a just transition for agriculture and land use to facilitate all of the requirements we need, that everything Tony talks about? Because agriculture has the ability to be the solution. We need to ensure that agriculture can adapt in a way that doesn't impact on small local communities. It's interesting. So there are 600 million farmers globally. 400 million of them only farm 2 hectares. So you're looking at, and those 400 million feed 35% of the world globally. So you're trying to change a whole land use system to facilitate the importance for ecosystem services that fundamentally sustain the whole of humanity. You know, Tony's 70% reduction in vertebrates. Actually, when you look at that, that's the equivalent of losing the global population of South America, North America, Australasia, Asia, and Europe. So it's an enormous event that has happened in our lifetime. You know, I'm a child of, I'm a 1970s born individual, and I've seen that depletion in the natural world. Can we address it? Of course we can. We have the ability, we have the technology, and we just need, it's about the implementation. And it's about understanding that some services don't necessarily provide economic reward, but they provide long-term certainty and sustainability. And it's how we address that.
Can you give us some examples then? Because, I mean, for people who aren't farmers in the room, you know, what is it that we just keep doing time and time again that actually we can't really do anymore? We haven't got the time to do.
We keep extracting. We keep depleting. We keep, you know, some of these, you know, if I look at the destruction of rainforests, if I look at the extraction of water resources, if I look at the endless requirement of the soils that we want them to produce food, we keep taking and give nothing back. And we have this one moment in time where we can start to put something back. And actually that has to work collectively. It can't have individuals. Yes, everything that we do on the North Norfolk coast, and we're making great impacts in improving biodiversity and in halting species decline, increasing biodiversity, protecting our soils. But that needs to happen at significant scale beyond just this little pinprick on the North Norfolk coast. And we can do it. And what we need is exemplars and examples of where that can take place to show others to be part of a bigger collective in ensuring longevity of humanity going forward. That's the reality.
To be clear, when we all go to the supermarket, is most of the food we're buying when it's grown in the UK, is it still fairly extractive? Is mainstream farming sort of treating the land still today as something that you just put chemicals on and you get crops off and not really investing in the soil?
Fundamentally, that's how it happens. Right. Every time, I love wandering supermarket aisles and looking, it's like a geography lesson. You know, I go to the co-op in Wales and I get my asparagus from Peru, and I get my tomatoes from the Caribbean, and interestingly, the carrots, we're 98% self-sufficient in carrot production, but this year, due to climate change and weather events, we had to import carrots from China. Importing carrots from China means we are taking water from China and bringing it here, because fundamentally the water was used to produce the carrots. So we need to completely reevaluate our system. We need to change our diets. everything that we eat, we are a very lucky generation. We've had a period we've had decades of complete glut in being able to purchase whatever we want, whenever we want. When I was a child, we had seasons. We had strawberries were in June. Strawberries weren't in December. Avocados were like a kind of rare product. And now we expect avocados all year. If we look at Spanish avocados, which are produced, which their harvest is generally December through to February, actually, we look at the Doñana, which is a really important wetland within southern Spain, and the extraction of water to produce the avocados, it's not exclusively avocados, but produce avocados, is having a significant detriment to the species that use the Doñana. That's why we are seeing cattle egret, glossy ibis, great white egret moving further north, because they've got nowhere else to go. So we have this ability to change our food systems that allow the natural world to readdress the balance because of our impact. So
I don't think we fully understand that yet as a sort of society. I don't know what you think on this, Tony, but I think when you pick up some green beans in the supermarket from Kenya, you go, oh, probably shouldn't because they've been flown in, and we're probably thinking carbon, but we're not actually thinking what it does to that landscape. Maybe.
I was just that thought. Brussels sprouts from Morocco. Whoever thought Morocco grew Brussels sprouts?
I sense you have a very long shopping list of all the places you've seen unusual produce from. Is that part of our problem, that our sort of we're out of touch? Because this isn't necessarily, I think what you're saying, Jake, is this isn't necessarily future technological advancements. This is actually looking at how maybe we did things in the 20s in terms of seasons and mixed models of farming.
Yeah, I think that's one aspect of the progressive disconnection of our society from how nature works. And, many people, they go to work in their car, they go to the gym, they go to an air-conditioned office, they go to the supermarket, they buy stuff in plastic bags, most of them probably not paying much attention to where the food has come from. And so this conversation around our dependence on the natural world, it's invisible. It's become really quite an abstract concept for most people, whereas my parents' generation, they grew quite a lot of their own food. I remember chickens being killed as a child, and, you kind of had a kind of direct line of sight to what kind of meat eating entailed. And, if there were failure of the vegetables, you could buy them at the shop, but you knew that kind of didn't work. And why didn't it work? Because it didn't rain and the soil was rubbish, or whatever it was.
And you wouldn't waste any of that chicken, would you? Because you fed it sort of by hand. You've seen what goes into it.
No, exactly. None of that would have been. It was treated as a special thing. Yeah. Whereas now, chicken in some forms, it's junk food, isn't it? By the time it's become a nugget and come out of a fast food joint, it's something that's seen as unhealthy, or, and it's not attached to the life of an animal anymore. It's become something completely out of context in a box or in a bag, which has got no reality to it anymore. And so I think, the conversation doesn't connect to most people at a personal level, and so they don't really know what's being said about this dependence between people and nature. And our water supply, we turn on a tap and we all get very upset when there's a hose pipe ban, but the changes that are taking place in the Earth's weather systems, or the loss of wetlands, which no longer are recharging aquifers, people, they're not aware. And so this is problematic when you go back to the point about this being a very broad-scale challenge that requires big interventions. That then in turn requires political support, and then you get into the hard choices that politicians need to make. And if the public are not with them, it's even harder to make those choices. And so therefore that disconnection with nature becomes a problem in how we're going to be able to conduct this transition, because it requires money, it requires people changing their behaviour, and if we don't have the public support to get behind all of that, it makes it much more difficult to do it. And so, there's a loop there, and this is why it is so important, I think, to have opportunities for people to get out and actually engage with the natural world, to see it and experience it, because without that, I fear the challenge becomes more difficult. There's a kind of a loop of logic there about our collective personal understanding of this, and then what's possible by way of change.
And while we're on that, have you ever heard a politician say we need to pay more for our food because it needs to be more responsibly grown?
And there we are. And so you were kind enough to mention my new book, which is about some of these subjects and about the extent to which social inequalities play into all of this. And so we've become very used over a period of decades for food being cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, at the same time as society has become very unequal. And then when you want to do something along the lines that Jake is putting into practice around here, in terms of a focus on soil health, fewer pesticides, then, there is an impact on food prices. And it may not be that big, but nonetheless, the plight of poor people in a cost of living crisis becomes the reason why we don't do it. And so it becomes, a set of drivers.
That's the red line, that you just can't charge more for the food.
You can't charge more for the food, no. But
we
know that we can do sustainable agriculture, agroecological techniques, organic, whatever the frame of reference for that more sustainable style of food production. It is perceived, at least, if not in reality, to have a cost implication, and that is a red line. We're not going to go there because it's going to make food more expensive. And that doesn't hit the better off middle classes particularly, it does hit the poor, and so the poor become the reason why we don't do anything. And that's a global phenomenon as well as a national one.
But the frustration is the policy said we need to have cheaper food, and the subsidies allow for cheaper food. But society wants to spend £1,000 on an iPhone. Society wants to spend £20 on a Netflix subscription. And they think that is a priority rather than food. So food has been deprioritised.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at percentage of expenditure on food, in the UK it's surprisingly low.
16%.
And then you go to Spain, and it's 28%.
Yeah, exactly. The culture's different.
The culture is completely. Yeah. We've changed our culture in our prioritization of our food. Whether it's food is an experience, it's a social element, it's the importance of seasonality. We need to readdress that, and that's part of the process where the chicken that I think Tony's a bit older than me, but I remember the chicken being at the Sunday roast chicken being a really important part of the week.
Yeah. And
we celebrated it, and we got together as a family, and we enjoyed it. And then we had chicken broth and risotto with rice for some reason. My mother liked putting raisins in with the risotto, but because she spent time in India. But it's that whole process of actually. The longevity and enjoying food for what it is, and we do the UK society's kind of lost that.
Well, I suppose if we take that as the example and we go to where we are in the extremity now, you can buy a chicken for less than a pint of beer in Tesco's. You can, because I'm in North London, so beer is quite expensive, but you can. And where you look at how is that chicken being produced? It's being produced in an intensive poultry unit, perhaps in the Wye Valley, where we know there are sort of 20 million birds, and it's being fed on imported soy and corn coming in from South America, perhaps from deforested areas. Well, so you have the nutrients coming from deforested areas in South America going into the Wye and smothering and killing that SAC of a river.
Yes, indeed.
Special area of conservation.
Yeah, and so this then invites conversations around fixing the entire food system, because not only are we doing all of that, we've got some terrible health statistics. Type 2 diabetes is one of them, which is in part linked to poor diet. And then on top of that, we're putting one third of the land we're growing food on into the bin effectively, if you look at the quantities of food waste going on. And so, that kind of translation from food as being something which has great meaning and great value into a cheap commodity means that we are quite happy to waste it in a way that was never the case 30 or 40 years ago. And so all of these things, they kind of stack on top of each other. Agriculture is then, a part of that bigger set of cultural kind of lifestyle, economic drivers, which are taking us to the brink of a mass extinction globally. And Jake's quite right. If you put your finger on one thing that is behind the global nature crisis, it's the food system. That's what's doing it. And that example of the Amazon being cut down to produce soybeans to feed to chickens to fill up the River Wye with phosphates and other pollution in order to get a £4 chicken, that's one manifestation of it.
Yeah. Before we go any further, we've sort of alluded to what you do in North Norfolk, but we haven't really said. So can you talk us through and walk us through some of the initiatives about how you produce food on the Holkham estate and how you answer these questions and how you make it as sort of responsible and as sustainable as possible?
Okay, so Holkham historic landscape owned by a family for hundreds of years that has historically always had a responsibility to looking after that landscape. From the Norfolk four-crop rotation, which was developed in Norfolk, not exclusively at Holkham. I'm conscious there were others that were involved in it.
Might be here today.
I know, I'm just got to
Relatives of.
read the audience. And the importance of protecting and preserving that landscape. So we see something called regenerative agriculture, which is a phrase that is being bandied about currently. And the Norfolk four-crop rotation and the importance of mixed farming systems is everything that Holkham was talking about, or Norfolk was talking about 200 years ago. So we're looking back at some of our past practices and re-implementing them in a new modern context, looking at the technologies, looking at machinery and implementation of inputs and when they are best effectively applied, and looking at break crops and cover crops and integrating livestock and the importance of livestock. So Holkham tries to have a holistic approach in the way it produces its food. If I look at the reserve, which is 1/5 of Holkham, that's a food system, and the cattle the 800 cattle that graze that are the ecosystem drivers that also produce food, and they are the wildebeest to enable all of a lot of the photographs you see behind us are from the reserve, and it's the cattle that are fundamental for that. So it's having a more holistic approach on ensuring that you have food that is produced in a healthy, nutritious way, economically, that actually has less of an impact on the environment. Nothing's ever perfect, and we learn. It's a constant learning. But if agriculture looks at the past and some of the practices of the past, and we implement them in a modern context, we can have a food system that has less of an impact. And Holkham is endlessly challenging itself and looking at ways it can produce food in a way that has less of an impact.
Let's stick with the cattle for a second then. So those animals are primarily for beef, or they are to be ecosystem engineers and across your marshes in the summer?
Depends who you talk to.
Right.
If you talk to me, they're my ecosystem engineers.
Right.
If you talk to the individuals that look after them, that's their business. Interestingly, the livestock business is not profitable, and that happens across the UK. Livestock is not a profitable business for a whole range of reasons, partly down to government policy and agricultural support. But actually, without them, we can't produce the lapwings and the redshank and the geese, and we can't produce the landscape that the 6.5 million people drive past every year to see. So,
explain that just for people who have seen your cattle out on say the marshes. What is it they're actually doing? What do they do for that landscape?
So they're creating the mosaic, and they're creating a range of habitats through their grazing. So I remember I had doing a webinar or something with Tony a few years ago, where a wildlife trust said they were going to remove their cattle because they had done a sustainability survey to realise the cattle were causing methane and were having an impact on their carbon audit.
Right.
And Tony's response were, do we remove the wildebeest from the Serengeti that produce carbon?
Yeah.
Because they're producing methane. So the cattle on the reserve, although they produce methane, they're actually producing a far greater range of benefits through the way that they manage. Because I can't, with men and machinery and mowers, I can't produce that same effect that nature requires from the cattle. And if I manage the cattle in a particular way, I will get greater biodiversity outcomes. And all of the monitoring that we carry out on the reserve suggests that the change in grazing, the change in water level management, the change in infrastructure that we've implemented in the last 6 years has significant benefits.
Right. And just to spell that out, I'm sorry, we will move on from cattle in a sec, but I think it's a good example. So the way they are grazing means that no one plant essentially is dominant, so you're getting that mosaic of different things coming through.
Yeah,
that's basically, and they're also recycling the nutrients because
they're recycling the nutrients. They're pooing, they're grazing some bits, they're grazing others. We're pushing them to graze other areas for longer because we want a change within the structure of the sward, the grasses, and we move them periodically, and then we give resting periods. So it's kind of back to the regenerative agriculture process of mob grazing. So the wildebeest in the Serengeti move with the rains. So we're trying to mimic that. We are the lions that move the cattle in order that we create that mosaic.
And you never get overgrazing. That's the point as well, where you're sort of starting to kill things off.
You don't want poaching. You're trying to create. Yeah.
Final question on cattle: what happens to them when they're not there in the summer? Are you buying in grain or soy from the Amazon to feed them in their barns in the winter?
This is circular agriculture. So the crops that are resting crops, so the legume leys that are grown on the arable land to rest the arable land to improve the soil organic matter, are then fed to the cattle. Right. So the cattle move into 5-star accommodation through the winter and are fed low input herbal leys through the winter to give the marshes a rest, because then we have 200,000 overwintering waders and wildfowl, and we don't need the cattle out there while they're doing that. They move in. Those wildfowl then graze the marshes while the cattle are in their Hilton, the Holkham Hilton, and then they come back out in order to enable that the benefits that they provide, because the cattle grazing, specifically now, is really important because it creates the sward at the right conditions for the geese and the widgeon, that then subsequently will graze again. And then when the cattle come back to graze, then the lapwing and the waders and the avocets and the snipe and the redshank will have the right habitat for them to benefit. So you're kind of, it's a 365-day process to allow everything to benefit. And then we get to eat belted Galloway beef 20 months' time.
Wow. Okay. And I think that's really important to go through. And the reason I want you to spell all that out is because at one end, that's what you can do. And it does take land, doesn't it? And it takes a lot of effort. But you are self-contained as a farm, and you're completely responsible for your inputs and outputs. But at the other end of the spectrum, you could just drain the marshes, you could plough everything up, you could spray it with chemicals, and you could never rest it and just see how many years you can get a crop out. They're the two extremes, aren't they?
They're the extremes. And if I look at the history of the Holkham marshes, where they've gone through all those processes, they've gone through draining, they've gone through cultivation and arable systems, and it now, if I look at it now sits in a space that actually benefits a wider range of outcomes: food, nature, environment, and people, because people are really important. So the millions of people that come and visit the nature reserve get to see the cattle, which they like to see the belted Galloways, and that's all very pretty, but they get to see the geese, and they get to. It's that interaction that makes it a more a circular system that benefits have wider outcomes.
And the interaction brings us back to what you were saying before, that people can then see it, can appreciate it, can sort of start to understand the landscape, and then we value it, and only once we value it can we fight to protect it.
Exactly. And so, all of those benefits that Jake just highlighted, I think this is, again, very often a missing part of the conversation about the use of our land, and the fact that we can and must get so much more from it than just food. And you often see this polarised discussion, don't we, Jake, in the media about, stop rewilding because we need food production, and, the environment must come second to how many calories we can get out of the land, when in fact the land needs to provide us with flood protection, carbon capture, biodiversity conservation, water quality, public health and well-being. And all of those things are hugely socially and economically valuable parts of the landscape, but very often we don't see them. They're kind of less visible, less understood.
Well, human minds and maybe political minds, I think, like to silo and do one thing.
One thing at a time.
And actually you're talking about a system that does so many things.
Yeah.
But I suppose the other argument would be that, well, if we really intensively farm some land and we get loads of food out of it, then we do free up some land through wilding.
Indeed. And so this is then where it becomes important to look at the whole landscape and to work out, as a country, how we can optimise all of the things that we need. So a high percentage of our own food, enough housing, infrastructure, industry, carbon capture. How do we fit all of that into a country the size of England? And you may very well say, and you would say, that in certain places food production really must be the priority. And in other places you would say biodiversity conservation and carbon capture would be the things that you'd really focus on. And ideally what you would find, as you can see at the Holkham National Nature Reserve, is that in quite a few places you could do multiple things at once. And so how do we favour a system whereby we can maximise the benefits for society, nature, the environment from the landscape, rather than just looking at it as a one utility kind of purpose that we're after, which has been food production, and now increasingly we're talking about more land being needed for housing. So that then brings you into thinking about, well, do we have a land use strategy for England? And we don't. And this is one thing that has
been promised, though, hasn't it?
No,
the
Secretary
agenda.
of State has promised one before Christmas.
Yeah, exactly.
Which Christmas?
And so that was, so we're now into a new political cycle. So this was something that the last government said it would do, didn't quite get round to it. The new government said it will do it. And so then what this looks like, we don't know. But, very interesting to just note some of the things that we've said. So as a country, so we know that we've committed to high amount of our own food being produced. We've said, 1 million houses over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think 1.5, I think I read.
1.5 million houses over the next 5 years. We have said that 30% of the country will be protected for nature and managed for nature by 2030. Presently on about 8%, if you take even the areas which are currently theoretically protected but not necessarily in good shape. But the point would be we're a long way from 30%, and we've said we want net zero carbon. And also, that not only is about offshore wind turbines, which you can see great examples of from the coast here. This is also about solar. It's also about some level of biofuels, both of which take land. And so this is probably the critical question, is how do you fit all of that into a country?
I'm going to add two more to your list as well. 75% of our rivers to reach ecologically good status, and 16.5% of England's total land area to be covered in trees by 2050.
There we are.
So all these competing things.
All in the same space. All in the same 130,000 square kilometres, which is how big England is. And we've got quite a lot more than that, which is the ocean, from which we're trying to now get a lot of renewable electricity, trying to get a lot of food still in the form of wild fish being caught. So, there are limits to what we've got, but what we don't have is a rational plan to be able to use all of that to meet all of our needs at the same time as recovering nature.
Is a rational plan possible? Because it's nice for us all to sit back and go, we're just waiting for the government to come up with this framework. But actually, how practical is a framework ever going to be, and will it be useful?
So the land use framework is written and sits on a desk waiting for a Secretary of State to publish it.
You know more than me. That's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Insider
it was
information.
written 2 years ago.
Okay.
So I know the individuals that have created it. It's about an evolution of a land use. It's not set in stone. It's not, I think the previous farming minister said we're not going to tell farmers where to grow potatoes. No, we're not, because it's about how you create that balance with all of the pressures on our land use, whether it's people, whether it's food, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's housing, or tree planting. Tree planting is a wonderful concept that politicians jump at, but it's not necessarily obvious, because actually you can do other forms of land use that can have a range of other benefits beyond just planting trees, because planting trees can tend to exclude people. But there are places to plant trees, and the right trees in the right place, the right areas that will produce food, and that's what a land use framework is about. It's about an adaptable, flexible long-term vision of how we utilise our land.
It probably stops politicians just making all these targets because they don't see. They just sort of come out with one on their own.
That's the nervousness of the two previous Secretary of States not to publish it, because it puts a line in the sand. So whether we do see the current Secretary of State who has said he's going to publish it, whether we see that. But I think I think generally all of us within land use think it's a good idea to at least start the conversation with a publication of it.
It's kind of an honesty moment, isn't it?
Yeah,
You're sort of checking if all the promises add up. And given we're starting at quite a tricky place where we don't produce our own food, we don't produce our own energy, you wonder if it can all add up and it can be self-sufficient. I mean, it probably can't. So what do you sacrifice?
The food security self-sufficiency one, which has come up in the last few years, is quite an interesting one. They're two very different things. You know, we're in lamb, we're 120% self-sufficient in lamb. We're 90% self-sufficient in carrots. We're 80% self-sufficient in potatoes. Why are we 80% self-sufficient? Is because we want to eat potatoes 365 days a year, and potatoes are grown seasonally. So how do we? That's about changing our diets rather than saying that, you know, I want to eat potatoes all year.
Yeah.
So,
although I was on a potato farm, I've learned a lot about potatoes this week on Countryfile, and it turns out actually you can get the varieties to see you out throughout the year if you've got the right storage.
And there's real pressures in potatoes growing about varieties and resistance to disease and pests and PCN nematodes and things like that. So it's.
So are we optimistic a framework will come out? Or I mean, I don't know. It's quite important for things like national nature reserves and triple SIs and things, isn't it?
The land use framework. Yeah. I think we'll see something. And as Jake says, it's going to need to be evolutionary. But probably what we're not in a position to do is start drawing lines on the map of England and saying this is food and that's nature and this is renewables. I don't think that would work. But to start getting a sense of direction as to how we can optimise these things. And as I said a moment ago, I think probably, you know, the key thing we should be aiming for is multiple outcomes in the same place. So, you know, carbon capture, water quality, food production, nature recovery, can we do that in the same hectare? And in quite a lot of places, including the Holkham National Nature Reserve, you can do that. And so then how do we line up the incentives, government incentives, private incentives, ways in which you can start to reflect these values in the market? Can we do that? Yes, we can. And so that's the journey that I think we need to embark on. As the chair of a nature conservation agency that never has enough money, I would say that, you know, in moving towards that outcome where you're getting multiple good things happening in the same place, the agriculture budget is going to be key. A lot of incentives we've got there to be able to encourage people to do things that are going to point in that direction. Another is the investments that will be made by water companies. Big questions around river water quality at the moment, quite rightly. Big emphasis on sewage. That's quite right too. However, the bigger challenge is pollution coming from agriculture. So can we take some of the money that the water companies will invest in rivers, instead of spending it all on sewage, which may not be the best outcome, why don't we spend some of it on agriculture to get a bigger bang for a smaller buck? And then the flood defence budget, which is multi-billions of pounds, instead of building concrete defences around vulnerable areas, why don't we start rewilding floodplains and restoring blanket bogs and renaturalising rivers, which would give us benefits which would be not only for keeping houses and businesses dry, but would also give us more water security and would also help to recover nature. And so this is where a land use framework hopefully will start to take us, is seeing the need for these more joined up approaches in the landscape. We're not there at the moment. I mean, part of the trouble is the way, you know, societies, Western societies in particular, organise themselves, everything's in a silo. There's a water budget, there's a flood budget, there's an agriculture budget, a nature budget, and these things rarely connect. And so trying to get them to connect up is a critical way in which we can get more positive impact out of the same budgets as well, apart from anything else.
So Tony, sorry, James. So, new administration, 6 years in, 5 years in as chair of Natural England?
Yeah.
I assume you've met the new Secretary of State.
Yes.
Are you confident that, there talks about the reduction in the agricultural budget, which affects nature because for some reason nature and agriculture are put in the same...
Yeah.
Do you have an air of confidence? So, we've got the fiscal review at the end of the month. Do you have an air of confidence with this new administration that they will deliver everything that I think you and I are aligned with on
So I think their instincts and ambitions are very positive in pointing in the direction that we need to go. But these things are very complicated. They take quite a lot of time. And actually, probably the most important thing I would say that we could do with at the moment is a period of stability. So you're right, Jake, I've been there for 5 years as chairman of Natural England. I'm on the 7th Secretary of State. And each time they change, the policy goes a little bit this way or a little bit that way, or we're more interested in this and less interested in that. And so if we have the same Secretary of State at the time of the next general election, I'd be delighted.
I'm pleased you brought up the money, though, because the other thing, you talked about it being siloed. The other thing is we quite like sort of tangible benefits, don't we, in our finances? I'm thinking of house building, where we take some land, maybe agriculture, and we build a house on it, the value goes up, we've got jobs, it clearly creates money. A lot of the things you're talking about, whether it's, a managed retreat with rising sea levels, whether it's restoring bogs or peatlands or whatever it is, doesn't have the obvious financial payoff, and maybe that's what's sort of holding. Nature's far more complicated than that, and that's what puts it down the pecking order.
It does do, and this is why the valuation of nature, I think, is quite important to start understanding the social and economic contribution, as well as knowing which rare moths live where and which rare birds are living where, so that we get a fuller appreciation of what's at stake as we're taking decisions that changes land use and changes the flow of benefits coming to society. And actually, Natural England will publish very soon, this month, October, a State of Natural Capital report, which is basically a stock take of the valuable assets that we have in the form of all of these nature benefits coming from ecosystems. We're going to publish a review of the state of all of that, with the intent of creating exactly what you just described, which is a fuller understanding of where value is being lost and where value hopefully can be regained by restoring a lot of nature. And so that is a gap. But we have enough data now to be able to know the direction of travel. And we talked a little bit before about habitats and species, which is one very important dimension of it. But if you start to look at the state of our natural capital from the point of view of all these other things as well, water, carbon, security, then, if we can feed that in to discussions around house building and what is, the set of choices that are really in play, rather than just looking at one, the economic benefit of building houses and not much else really on the table, if we can start to blend in an understanding of what the nature values are that are being lost, and crucially, the nature values that we could regain by linking the housing to the restoration of nature in that landscape, then, a different conversation starts to unfold. We're not there yet, but we could be. We've got increasingly strong data, and, if we can align the policy to get behind the data, we might finish up in some better places. But, Jake touched on this a second ago about the land use framework. It is a political process, and so there will be winners and losers from all of this. And, certainly in my time as chair of Natural England, I've seen, various interest groups in economic sectors, expressing views about nature being too much of an issue, the environmental rules are too strong, and, we need to free up the ability of companies to build houses. That countervailing pressure is there, which means that we're going to have political leadership in making this happen, in being able to say, hang on, it's not just the houses, it's not just the food, it's also a whole load of other values that we have to retain and rebuild in order to meet good outcomes for people. That's going to require political leadership as well as data.
I have to say, I'm really confused and conflicted when it comes to putting a sort of price on nature. Because on one hand, if you look at it broadly, nature's sort of been trashed by free sort of economic markets because it hasn't had a voice and it hasn't had a value. Well, but as soon as you give it a value, then can't it be just traded away?
Difference between value and price.
Right.
And if we know the value of a wetland or a peat bog, we may say, the last thing we'd probably say is put it in the market, because we've understood the value. You may say you cannot build there because it's protected, because it's got huge value.
Yeah, okay.
And so it just helps us to make better choices, I think. I don't think it necessarily leads to the market being brought in to every aspect of...
Because we've had a go with
nature
biodiversity
recovery.
net gain, haven't we?
Yeah,
We sort of
and
price
so-
up bits of nature and do it elsewhere.
But that's a compliance market, and this is different to a free market. And in the absence of the biodiversity net gain policy, houses would be built, and there wouldn't be a requirement on the house builders to repair nature either locally or somewhere else
So it's
nearby.
better than nothing, yeah.
Well, yes, exactly that. It's better than nothing.
There was a wonderful review commissioned by the previous administration called the Descriptor Review on how we put a price on nature and the importance of putting a price on nature. And they call something intrinsic value. And so when you speak to an accountant about values for trees, there's the wonderful example at Holkham where the forester valued a tree because it was a particular specimen of a certain age at £30,000. The accountant goes, well, cut it down and we can release that value. But you cut it down, it has a value of £5 because it's a shit bit of timber.
All right.
So then if I look at the Holkham pine woods that everyone sees, this sort of landscape feature, the value there are the millions of people coming to that landscape to see it. So that's the value.
Yeah.
So how we put a value on nature, until we get people to engage with it and appreciate it, like the tens of thousands of geese that overwinter here or the calling curlew on the uplands, then we start to put a value on it. The frustration is the accountants struggle with a breeding lapwing on a piece of potato land is worth 300, 500, whatever it is. And that's the distortion in the value, because the value is within our hearts and minds rather than within our wallets.
That stuff's more tricky, isn't it? The intrinsic values, they're real. And actually, I think probably I would say that, let's not even attempt to put a financial value on those. But what we can do is we can make more rational judgments around carbon, clean water, flood risk. Flood risk is a good one, because you can look at how much it would cost you to build a concrete sea wall, and then you could look at how much it would cost to make a managed retreat to create a salt marsh that might be even better than the concrete, but would have all these other benefits. And there you can make some very kind of translatable economic judgments.
Is carbon the way in, actually? Because carbon is the easiest thing that we're used to calculating now. If you put a price on carbon, that would be the easiest way, would it?
Yeah, carbon is problematic in the sense that people get obsessed with it.
Yeah.
And so, you can get situations where, beautiful, very valuable from an intrinsic and biodiversity point of view, chalk grassland could have a load of Christmas trees planted over it because they're going to catch carbon, and there have been cases of this, and that's a really bad choice.
Or digging up peatland. There's loads of examples.
Yeah.
But there's a phrase called nature-based solutions, which that can have multiple benefits, and something. So we're in a landscape recovery pilot on the North Norfolk coast. And we're looking at improving the rivers, but also enhancing the SSSI by taking land that is historically arable and building on the biodiversity benefits of the core area, which is the SSSI, to allow nature to spill out and go elsewhere. So some really sort of key principles in improving biodiversity. And one of the nature-based solutions is creating wetlands that benefit biodiversity, that store carbon, but actually can also be used for agriculture. So it's trying to have these multi-process approaches to how we do stuff, as opposed to saying, right, I'm going to build a reservoir, I'm going to line it with plastic, and that I'm going to extract from the chalk aquifer when there's high water flows through the winter. Actually, we can be a bit more interesting in the way we approach things. So I can create a wetland that actually has an amazing benefits to biodiversity, that also has people benefits because there's something for them to come and see, that then can be utilised by agriculture, then produce our food. And this whole storytelling and the connectivity with the process needs to be the way we think about things, as opposed to this silo approach to going to build a house, going to mitigate that house building by creating something here, and I'm going to offset that there, and I'm going to get some sort of blended finance, which really isn't happening because they're just offsetting something and they're doing something rather nasty elsewhere. We can have this. We just need to have a broader approach, and that, from my perspective, is what a land use framework is all about. It's having a bigger, more broader approach to all of the solutions and all of the challenges that society has currently.
Yeah, very good. I'm conscious that it's already 4:30 and we haven't had any questions. So we're going to come on to questions in a second. We're going to go roaming mic out. While we do that, I'll just ask you another one. So we've talked a lot about, your 7th Secretary of State that you're now dealing with. We have government, good mandate, in power for 5 years. What are the easy wins that you think they could get right now? Because governments are always looking for them. And perhaps more interestingly, given they've got 5 years ahead of them and they've got a bit of support behind them, what are the really difficult things they need to sort of decide now that might start to bear fruit? Maybe not this Parliament, but next Parliament.
Oh, easy wins. Well, none of them are too easy, although there is one which I think is quite straightforward, and that would be to have a decision on the reintroduction of wild release of beaver into England. This has been something that's been sitting around now for a few years, and talking of ecosystem benefits and how you can get quite a big impact quite quickly, these animals are amazing in creating wetlands that hoover up a lot of sediment and nutrients and carbon, and which create the most amazing wildlife habitats. It's been more controversial than I think is warranted. However, a judgment to be made there, but I think that is a relatively easy win. Some of the others I've already mentioned, and again, it's not necessarily that easy, but I think there are some big benefits that would come quite quickly from a much stronger integration between the agriculture budget and nature recovery. That's work in progress, and there's some really good things going on there, actually. So I'm not...
But the unpopular thing they might have to do now that would actually have a good payoff, the things that the politicians don't want to do but probably should.
Well, actually, more nature-based solutions from the water side, I think, would be good. So there's many tens of billions being talked about now as investment that will come from the private water companies into trying to clean up our rivers. If we emphasise nature-based solutions more than the upgrading, alongside the upgrading of our rather creaking sewage infrastructure, I think we get some big wins there on the nature side, because there's some big money associated with that.
Yeah, and we should say pioneered a lot of it in Norfolk, the constructed wetlands that's been built over near Sandringham. I forget, what's the
Stiff Key River, isn't it? Yeah.
No, the first one that they...
the
Ingoldesthorpe, constructed wetland and cleaning up the sort of sewage effluents. Yeah, really
very good example. And the water company love that, because not only is it cleaning up the River Ingol, but this constructed wetland, there's a wetland on the edge of the sewage treatment works. Sewage treatment works doing quite a lot of the cleaning, some residue of nutrients in the water coming out, and so that water is now running through a wetland, which is
3 cells,
full of wildlife.
Isn't it?
Yeah, lots of wildlife and insects and birds and plants and everything in there, and then it goes out at the bottom of that into the river. The water company like this because they need to spend less money on electricity and less money on chemicals doing that same work, which is now being done by nature-based solution.
Yeah.
Very kind of good example.
And I think we're going to hear a lot about it, aren't we?
Yeah,
I think some water companies in this next 5-year period have a lot built in. I can't believe, actually, with Charles here, we haven't said much about chalk streams in this, but I would just say on the beaver front, to protect, because there's a lot of worry when it comes to chalk streams about beavers, because beavers are great in certain... We've got Baconsthorpe, where they're at the headland of a chalk stream. They've effectively created a reservoir, so this chalk stream can run throughout.
Exactly.
But when you start felling trees on chalk streams which don't have much natural flow in a constricted landscape where the river can't go round them, then that starts to be a problem, doesn't it?
Well, the policy is you move them.
Right.
And if you can't move them, you shoot them.
Right.
I mean, this is like a pretty straightforward policy, I think, really.
Yeah. You get a nice pair of slippers and you get a chalk stream. Right, before we go to questions, the same question to you then, Jake. Are there easy wins, or what are the really difficult decisions they need to make now to make some progress?
Are there easy wins? I think the importance of giving confidence within the agricultural sector through this transition. So when we decided to exclude ourselves from our closest trading partner, and we created our own agricultural policy, And when farmers and landowners were asked how long you want to transition for, so we decided to go by death by 1,000 cuts with a 7-year transition. It would be to ensure that we get confidence within the sector, within the agricultural sector, that they are the solution and they're not the problem.
Right. So right now, farmers, I mean, you can't speak for all farmers, but feel there isn't enough certainty. They don't quite know where their support and their payments are coming from.
So for a whole range of reasons, if I look at the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which fundamentally underpins the Agricultural Act, and we have a sustainable farming incentive where 600 farmers have applied for SFI 24, and none of them have got assurances that it's going to happen. Right. We've got high-level stewardship. We've got higher tier stewardship where farmers have ended agreements and we don't have new agreements coming forward because indecisions and political processes and lack of resource within Natural England to oversee where they implement those agreements best. Fundamentally, some of the greatest gains within the environment have been in agri-environment. So high-level stewardship, which was historically overseen by, all of it was overseen by Natural England. That was taken away through a political decision and given to the Rural Payments Agency. Natural England only oversee a part of it. Natural England's advice and on-the-ground interaction with farmers and landowners was key to delivery and creating impact environmentally. So there's lack of confidence there. So we need to ensure that that confidence is rebuilt. Already, we were promised high-level stewardship we would hear something in July, then we had an election, we're going to hear something in August, and now we're hearing maybe it's in the new year, or maybe as late as sort of middle of next year. That a huge lack of confidence from
everyone
farmers.
keeps coming out with pots and schemes and everyone's head spinning and everyone's not quite sure. And the old policy was, common agricultural policy, you just got money per acre, which was bad for lots of reasons, but actually that's the certainty you want, but just with the new vision of how you actually improve the landscape.
So, I think I have real confidence with the ambition of what the Environmental Land Management Scheme is about.
Yeah.
I think it can deliver huge amounts.
Which is nature-friendly farming, isn't it, essentially?
Exactly. What we have is, through this transition, is a lack of confidence within the sector to implement it.
Yeah.
There are some great things going on, but we need to do this at scale.
Wonderful. Right. I will let you have some questions now. Sorry, it's taken a while. Do we have any questions? Please put up your hands. And I think Charles is going to do roaming microphone. Work your way up, Charles. Yeah.
Go here first. Oops.
Jake, you particularly mentioned about storytelling and connectivity in terms of actually changing a culture or changing behaviour. If we needed something like Mr. Bates versus the Post Office for nature recovery, what might that look like?
Tony's new book. No, I think, from my perspective, storytelling and examples of how to make a difference are really key. I think that there's a whole range of individuals, and I could, without promoting other people's books, I can think of a whole range of individuals that give us examples of what they can do, from the uplands to the lowlands to the highlands. And storytelling throughout time, and I had Robert McFarlane, who we drove around earlier, who's an amazing writer and storyteller. And he asked me that same question, and it is when thousands of years ago humans sat round campfires and explained the natural world and explained how the interaction between the water and the animal and the food that they gathered and the sustainability of their lifestyle. And that storytelling still exists today, because I can think of a whole range of examples of individuals that have told stories that have engaged us. I recently watched the witness statement from David Attenborough, which I highly recommend, which came out a couple of years ago, but I highly recommend. And he looks at all of the challenges of society and all the impacts that we've had. But he also gives a solution. And that's key. It's, frustrates me the doom and gloom of some storytellers that it's all a disaster, but actually provide me with a solution and provide me with a way forward, because that engages people. If there are organisations out there that want your money to say everything's fucked, and give us your money and we can sort it. But actually, the ones that we give our money are the ones that give us examples of how to make things better. And that's a much better way of moving forward rather than the pessimistic view. So storytelling, positive storytelling, has a key for unlocking the sustainability of humanity.
It must be about diversity of voices as well. Just to say that my Panorama colleagues had made 3 panoramas about the post office, right? And then it's a drama team at ITV that suddenly get everyone to care. They're sort of banging their heads against the wall. But it doesn't. But it's natural England. It's farmers that need to keep talking to everyone, because you never know which storyteller is going to suddenly unlock that moment, I guess, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Very illuminating, very thought-provoking. You talk about storytelling. Quick question. How is what you've just said today going to be shared? Are you recording? Is this being recorded?
I believe it is, yes. How it's actually going to be shared, I don't know. But
because we ought to be sent it so that we can share it with families and friends and colleagues and what have you. There's a lot of very useful information there. Thank you.
From my understanding, the organisers have told me that this will go out on a YouTube-type style thing, if you know how the technology works, at some point in the next 2 weeks.
I mean, it'll be so viral, you won't be able to escape it. I have every confidence that...
There's a young lad down at the front with a camera.
But thank you, and thank you for saying that, because it'd be lovely if Tony and Jake's wisdom made it into more people's inboxes. Right.
As you say, Jake, it's a lot of doom and gloom, and you've explained so wonderfully all the various different things that can happen. But as an individual sitting here, what can we all do? What can we take away from this? What can we do as individuals to make a difference tomorrow?
Tony, go on. That was directed at me.
Well, I'll have a go. So individuals, I think we all have agency at multiple levels. So one is the engagement we have with the political process. So we vote once every 5 years in a general election and in local elections more frequently. But I think being in touch with our elected representatives and just reminding them of the importance of all of this, I think that's a really powerful thing that everyone can do. So, and you can do it either directly or you can do it via being active in groups like Friends of the Earth or the Wildlife Trust and some of these folks who organise the voice of the public to be visible to who we elect to represent us. So there's that. You have a lot of agency as someone who engages with, all the things we buy. So, who do you bank with? Where do you get your groceries? Ask those people, if you go into Tesco's, for example, do they have a zero deforestation policy? Are they attentive to what's going on in the Amazon and therefore the beef that's coming into the shop and everything else that they're selling? Have they got their arms around that? And I know from my campaigning days at Friends of the Earth, when you ask those questions to big companies, they pay attention. They know, especially in that sector where they're on a knife edge, they're competing with each other in really tight margins. If they think the consumers care, they will start paying attention to it. So you can do that. The other thing we can all do is show some level of leadership. I remember at Friends of the Earth, again, going back to the early 90s when recycling was a really weird fringe thing. Nobody did it. The Friends of the Earth groups were doing that, and they were trying to get people to collect cans and bottles and paper. And the more people who did it, the more normal it became, and therefore that then gathered momentum to the point where it became a government policy, and everybody now does it as a matter of course. And so that individual leadership, if your colleagues see you arriving to work on your bike rather than in your car, if your neighbours see you put in the recycling in the correct bin, all of these things, they rub off. We're highly social creatures. And so we're always looking for our peers, friends, family, for what is the kind of right, normal thing to do. And so the more of us that are doing normal things that look like they're pointing in the right direction, that will make a difference as well. So I think those 3 headings of be kind of positively engaged with politics, look to the market and where you're buying things that you need and making sure that the people who are selling it to you are on the case, and then show some personal leadership. And then if you do all those, you'll be a very powerful citizen on trying to bend the curve on all of this.
Yeah, go on. I was going to add to that as a journalist, I'm making my third panorama on sewage at the moment, and it all started just with literal individuals. It wasn't a charity, it wasn't a government committee, it wasn't anything. It was a couple of guys. One was a sort of retired professor, one was a former copper who lived by a river and couldn't work out why it had gone really murky. And they started looking at data, and then they started challenging. And ultimately, it grew and grew and grew to the point where they were briefing MPs. MPs were grilling water company bosses, and now sewage, sewage discharge has always been going on, right? But now it's a massive issue, and you can trace it back to literally a couple of citizens who just cared and kept asking questions. So it's amazing the power any individual can have when they care.
I think the modern term is an influencer. Be an influencer at whatever level.
Yeah.
You don't have to be an influencer and have a squillion social media followers. You can be an influencer by talking to the person in the supermarket on why you're buying that product. You can be an influencer on the way you manage your hedges, and your neighbour can look at the way you're managing your hedges and what you're implementing. So actually, and that grows, and people see that, and if people see there are benefits on that, it just naturally flows throughout society. So I think it's everything that Tony eloquently promoted, but actually it's just influence others by your own actions.
Where's the mic? Yes, hi.
You talked earlier about silos, particularly in the sense of government silos for different pots for different things, and people being in government departments being in competition with each other for those pots of money. My question is there any sign that you were also talking about it being really difficult to measure and value wildlife, biodiversity, regeneration of habitat, etc. Is there any sign that perhaps we might start using another value measurement other than money, so that it can some kind of measurement that can kind of give a value, a numeric value, a quantitative rather than a qualitative value to those things, so that you can kind of count everything in the same way, rather than saying, well, this is worth money, but this isn't. So how do we count that?
Tony, do you want to take that?
So often in these kinds of environmental discussions where you get into that kind of question, you get into this growth versus no growth kind of dilemma. And I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I've reached the conclusion it's not so much the question of growth or no growth which is the issue. It's what we're measuring as growth, which is the key thing. And then if you start to look around at different attempts to crack this challenge of measuring more than one thing at a time, you come across a few examples of where people have delved into it, including something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which was the result of some work done by, I think, a World Bank economist and a philosopher. His name's presently escaped me, but what they did, they took GDP as one measure of growth, but they added to it environmental sustainability, happiness, longevity, social cohesion, the amount of waste and pollution created by a society, and they put all those together into a single metric so that you can see if you're growing a whole lot of positive stuff at once, or whether you are trading off one growth, GDP, against other things that should be growing, the health of the environment, the happiness of society, but actually are going down, not least because of how you've chosen to promote the growth in the GDP. And so this is, I think, a key question for how we go forward on all of this, is being able to measure our progress in terms that go beyond the simple generation of financial wealth, which is what GDP ultimately comes down to. I think there are ways of doing that, but they're going to require a little bit more attention to be built into national accounts. And in fact, this work we're doing in a couple of weeks with Natural England, our State of Natural Capital report, that will give us one body of data that could do exactly that. You could feed that in to a progress indicator which is measuring more than simply economic activity in traditional terms. And I would argue that the state of natural capital is a huge economic issue, but it's just invisible at the moment in terms of how we're reporting progress.
I've seen lots of hands going up.
Okay.
Now we've got to wind up in a few
Getting
minutes.
well beyond my
Sorry.
remit as the chair of Natural England now, but
Yes, at the back.
Would it be a help if I stand up? Charles Coburn, former lobbyist, now full-time troublemaker. I live in East Hampshire, in the Hampshire Downs just outside Alton, through which the River Wey flows. 57% of East Hampshire district is overlaid by the South Downs National Park. Another 13% covers the ranges that the Army used to own and which are incredibly biodiverse and are being given suitable protection, leaving 30% of the district in which to build houses. The government don't appear to understand that these are hard constraints. In other words, we can't build in the national park, and we can't build on the protected biodiverse areas. That leaves 30% of all the land for houses to go. The local farmers have been corrupted by developers. They would rather grow houses than crops and livestock. The existing stock, including recently built estates, don't have the sufficient infrastructure to support them. And the consequence of that is that 2 weeks ago, an estate built just above the source of the River Wey flooded, and the Wey is now being polluted at its very source. Here's my question. How do we protect our greenfield sites? Because those are the only places that the houses can go. And how do we get the government to listen to us?
Tony, I fear that's one for you again. I think you were labelled a head of an environmental quango that puts red tape on housing by the Daily Mail.
Exactly.
So that's yours.
We get a lot of criticism at Natural England for raising these very questions around river pollution and land use planning and the impact on protected sites. And so we get a lot of interaction on this. We've talked about this a little bit already, about the need to have a much more integrated approach towards land use decisions. And so building in a place that's liable to flooding, this is simply not sensible. And yet some of the economic drivers, which may be there for the house building companies and, a local authority under pressure to put more houses in, the temptation may be, we'll put it there anyway. And so having a stronger set of processes which are going to enable us to make better spatial decisions, which not only are about the housing, but also about the state of nature and how over time we can improve nature, is what's needed. And, as you can imagine, this is not necessarily welcomed by everyone who works in the built environment sector. They want, freedom, latitude, the ability to be flexible. But I fear that's where this needs to be captured, is in a development planning system which is much more closely connected to a spatial planning system which is about nature recovery and bringing the two together to the point where you would conclude that actually building in a floodplain by a river, especially near its source, is probably not a good idea. And what you might want to do is link the housing, which might be near to there, to the rewilding of that floodplain to make it into a wonderful resource for nature, which is protecting the river at the same time as providing a wonderful place for people to take their children after school. All of that kind of stuff needs to be blended in to a much more joined-up system of land use planning. I think is probably where I would locate the answer. And the woman who raised the question a little bit earlier about what we can do as individuals, there is a new bill going into Parliament, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And as a citizen with views on this, that's an opportunity for you to speak to your Member of Parliament to hopefully feed in some kind of thinking that would help us get a good result through that legislation, because that legislation could do exactly what I've just described if it finishes up going in that kind of path. And that will be down to the politicians hearing from their constituents in some part.
Right. I'm told we're running well over. So I think, Charles, one more question. You've got a microphone in place. Okay.
Hi, I'll stand up as well. I'm also a full-time troublemaker. Brilliant discussion.
Another
Thank
one.
you. Yeah, another one. Thank you very much. My question is, which of Labour's two personalities do you think is going to win? It's slightly schizophrenic. You've got Steve Reed talking quite a lot of good stuff about nature, and then you've got all the others talking about build, and prisons and pylons and houses and solar farms on Greenfield, etc., etc. So which personality is going to win?
Jake can answer that.
Thanks, Tony. So we're just about to go to 100 days of the new administration. I think that's next week is their first 100 days. And they're all talking, each department is is picking up their own ambition. But there are elements within the administration that talks to the importance of collective thinking. So I would like to think that there was collective thinking, and if I look at the sector that's, or the department that's closer to my work, is that the Steve Reed will understand the importance of working with health and finance, because they collectively work together. And actually, if we get the drive for having better environments that are better for people, that are healthier, that can have wider benefits to improve growth, and I must admit, the perpetual growth is unsustainable. And the drive for more and more and extract, I think, is from a personal perspective, I think is rather short-sighted in the medium to long term. But actually, if we get the balance right, I would like to think that although Steve Reed talks, he's slightly bipolar in what I've seen to date. He's talking one thing and then he's talking something else, and I'd like to think that he would be more aligned with some of his other secretaries of states, that there was a collective ambition. So that hasn't really, I don't think that's answered your question.
Regardless of personalities, I mean, there is certainly just a lot of noise coming out about economy first. If we can get the economy going, then we can think about other things. And I think you would say that it shouldn't be an afterthought, the environment, and actually they need to happen side by side. And what confidence do you have that both will progress?
Well, what I would say to our government, and actually I do say to our government, nature is the economy. And if you want to grow the economy, you've got to grow nature. And in fact, we will title the new Natural England strategy, it will be called Growing Nature for Health, Wealth and Security. So we've got growth in there, but it's about growing the nature, and it's about making the linkages to public health and well-being, our economy and our security, including food and water, and our ability to deal with climate change. So that's where we're taking the conversation, is to try and encourage people to just join up some dots and recognise that if we continue to degrade and destroy our environment, in the end we will destroy ourselves. And that can't be anyone's policy, I wouldn't have thought.
No, well, we will watch your progress with interest, and I hope you have plenty of influence. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for listening. It has been recorded, so I would say keep an eye on the festival website. It's probably the best place to find out if a recording gets posted at some point. So once again, please put your hands together for Tony Juniper and Jake Fiennes.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Great.
Thank you very much, all of you. That was just a fascinating discussion, fascinating questions. The fact there were so many more, I think, is testament to how interesting it was, exactly what we were hoping would happen at this festival, festival ideas and discussion and so on. So thanks for travelling up here and for giving us such a fascinating insight into these crucial issues. So well done.
Thank you. Thanks very much.